G'day, Joseph Drew here from the Institute of Public Policy and Governance, introducing you to week 6 readings, which is about local government expenditure, accruals, and the principle of subsidiarity. Now, expenditure, as I note in your notes for your readings, and as you will read in your readings, has been increasing at a phenomenal rate for Australian local government, about 8% per annum over quite a lengthy period of time. Now, that's not a problem if revenues are keeping up with expenditure. However, if revenues don't keep up with expenditures, there's only a few things that can happen. You can draw on your capital reserves for a period of time, and eventually you'll have to take on debt to meet your expenditure needs. Now, it's doubtful whether 8% increases in expenditure are sustainable in the long term. Think about your own situation. Are you prepared to pay an extra 8% per annum in local government tax year after year after year? Have you been paying an extra 8% per annum in local government tax year after year after year? The answer is probably no. Furthermore, in many states, as we've discussed in previous weeks, there's rate capping in place. Rate capping's in place because it's popular. People don't want to pay more for their local government taxation. They want it capped to something that's generally around CPI, 2.5%. So the answer is probably that this sort of increase in expenditure isn't sustainable in the long term. Maybe in the short term we can sustain it, but in the long term we can't keep increasing it by these rates. Moreover, the rate of increase in expenditure is probably greater than what we can see here, for two main reasons. One reason is over this period of time, a lot of councils have been divested of certain services such as water and sewer services, yet the expenditure still increased in a gross fashion, which seems to imply that the net increases to services other than those that were divested have actually been greater than 8%. Also, we have unreliable depreciation accrual data. There's been a number of papers written on this. I've written one that's in your readings this week. There's another excellent paper by Stalbrink. And the long and the short of it is there's a lot of evidence that for government and corporate accounting that depreciation accrual expenditure data is not reliable. Now, for non-accounting people, what is depreciation accruals? Well, basically, many years ago we changed from cash accounting to accrual accounting. Under cash accounting, if I build a $1 million bridge, in the year that I built it, I would have an expenditure of $1 million. Under accrual accounting, if I build my $1 million bridge, and I think it's going to last for 10 years, I would apportion 1/10 of the $1 million for each and every year as an expenditure, called a depreciation expenditure item, until such time as the asset has been fully apportioned. That's the simplest definition. There's a little bit more to do with scrap values and different methods of depreciation, but that's basically what happens. Now, as I said, there's a big literature that says the depreciation accruals aren't reliable, and some have even questioned whether it was ever a good idea to have a depreciation accrual accounting for government assets in the first place. Hence your reading from Harris, which I think is an excellent reading. Personally, I have strong reservations about it. My biggest reservation is that at the end of the day, depreciation accruals must be based on some objective judgment of the fair value of the asset. Now, if you look at AASB 116, which is the accounting standard that covers this, fair value is the cost at which an asset could be bought between knowledgeable and willing parties in an arm's length transaction. And the problem with government assets is that there is no market. There is no market out there for bridges. I can't sell my bridge. There's no way of me understanding what the fair value of this bridge is. And when you lose that foundation of fair value, everything becomes very arbitrary. And it can end up being the case that the depreciation expenditure items aren't reliable. If this is the case, then our expenditure data that I quoted earlier, the increases in expenditure, actually might be a lot higher or lower than what we think if they include depreciation expenditure that we can't rely on. So, what happens, as I say, if expenditure is too great? Either we have to run down our capital reserves or we have to increase debt. Eventually that won't be sustainable in the long term. The principle of subsidiarity is a way of dealing with this problem. The principle comes from the natural law philosophical tradition, which first started with the work of Aristotle, but this principle itself was enunciated as part of the Catholic social teaching by Pope Pius. Don't let that put you off. It has no direct religious ideas embedded in it at all. It's a very useful principle. It's actually the principle that's used to regulate interactions in the European Union, it's specifically stated there. And I also note that natural law philosophy, there's a tradition, as obviously in the Catholic social teaching, but there's also a tradition in Judaism and a tradition in Islam. So all three monotheistic faiths have natural law traditions. But the principle of subsidiarity simply is a way of saying that we need to balance two things. We need to balance human dignity and the dignity of associations against the common good. You need to be able to define both of these things. Human dignity, or the dignity of associations, is the right of persons or associations to pursue their existential ends, to be everything they want to be and can be, without undue interference. The principle, the idea of the common good, is the idea that we benefit when we draw from the common good by greater than the individual contributions. It's the help that we receive from others as a result of our cooperation. Okay. Now the principle of subsidiarity is basically saying that there's two obligations. One is usually recognized, the other one's usually ignored. Okay, so there's a negative obligation that larger organizations, higher tiers of government or whatever, shouldn't subsume the functions of lower organizations. When they do take on functions which aren't rightly part of their sphere, they will be burdened by expenditures that may become too great for them, and they may be crushed under the overwhelming weight, as Pope Pius says, which you'll read in that paper. The other part of subsidiarity is the need for subsidium. Subsidium is the help that is provided to lower order associations or persons when they can't meet their bona fide needs. This help must be provided in a way that makes it as superfluous as quickly as possible. You shouldn't create a situation or circumstances of dependency on ongoing help. That's not good for the donor, it's not good for the recipient. Now, the paper that you will read from Publius, you may have to read it a few times to understand it, but basically the key message is this. If local governments stick to their needs rather than wants, they will be more financially sustainable. If local governments stick to their correct remit, if they foster a plurality of associations that provide a lot of the functions which they currently have taken over, perhaps unnecessarily, then they will be more sustainable. The principle of subsidiarity is a philosophical position. It talks about the rights and wrongs of the tasks and responsibilities that local governments take on, and the rights and wrongs of what happens if local governments take on responsibilities which aren't rightly theirs. Now clearly, if you keep expanding your responsibilities, your expenditure will increase. Now if you're not collecting additional revenues, then you won't be financially sustainable. But under the principle of subsidiarity, even if you are collecting additional revenues to pay for that additional expenditure, wrongs are being committed because people are being taxed to pay for things that are rightly the responsibility of individual persons or persons in associations and smaller associations. So it's all about respecting the recipients but also respecting the donor. The donor is the taxpayer, and the donor is the taxpayer, but it's usually neglected in a lot of the literature. So I do commend the subsidiarity reading to you. It's a document you'll have to read quite carefully. It's a powerful idea that could save local government. And indeed, it's an idea that I cover thoroughly in my forthcoming book, Saving Local Government. Now, you've got a number of readings here. As I said, the Drew and Grant paper on subsidiarity at Publius, very important reading. There's a paper there from Drew and another paper from Stalebrink showing you the depreciation accrual problem and the extent of that problem. There's a paper there from Gene Harris, which is an excellent paper talking about all the problems with accrual accounting when it comes to government organisations. And there's another brilliant paper from Sirico on subsidiarity in society. Admittedly, it is geared more to the welfare state and welfare functions rather than local government, although in many countries local government does perform welfare functions. But the ideas are still the same ideas. The idea is that when you provide help that's not necessary, that's not needed, that is only wanted rather than needed, you're not respecting the donor and you're not actually helping the recipient. It's an interesting idea, it's a radical idea, but it's a very old idea. And the prediction of Pope Pius was that if we continue to expand the remit of government into areas that associations and persons themselves should be dealing with, eventually government would be overwhelmed and crushed by its responsibilities, and that's what we're seeing in the world. As I said a few weeks ago, you can see a map of local government bankruptcies in America. There's bankruptcies in South America, in Germany, in Asia, and in Australia. So it's a serious issue. We need to do something to fix it, and this proposes a moral theory for how we could address that. I do hope you enjoy your readings this week, and please also note that I'll be putting up a video very shortly about assignment 1